Charles Bronson, once Britain's most violent prisoner, has been locked up for over 50 years. Should he be released? Let's discuss it. Oi, Savaloys, welcome back to Beyond Conviction. Firstly, before we start, I'd like to say massive thanks to the now 52 subscribers that I have on my channel. It's just so appreciated that he's enjoying my content and you want to see more. So that's what you'll get. So thank you very much. Anyways, today's video, as I mentioned, we're going to be discussing Charles Bronson, or otherwise known as Charles Salvador. He's been in prison for just a little over 50 years now. And there's a lot of talk in the general public domain. Should he be released? Just a little background on Charles Bronson. I'll refer to him as Charles Bronson, even though he's known as Charles Salvador. A lot of people don't know him or refer to him as such. He's always been known as Charles Bronson. So just for ease and to reduce any confusion, we'll refer to him as Charles Bronson. So Charles Bronson, who was born Michael Peterson, as I said, better known as Charles Bronson, he's an English criminal who has been in prison since 1974. And in 1974, he initially received a 7-year sentence for the armed robbery of a post office with a sawn-off shotgun. However, whilst in prison, he's just got his sentence extended multiple times. And he's only spent a very, very small amount of time outside of prison. When he was released, I think it was like 1987, he was released only for a matter of weeks until he tried to turn over a jewellery shop, an attempted armed robbery, and he was sent back to prison in 1988. Well, whilst he was out for that short amount of time, he took up bare knuckle boxing and was very well known on the scenes of, like the fighting scenes on the cobbles of East London. And that's where he got his name, Charles Bronson, which was after the American actor Charles Bronson. I mean, I've never watched any of his films, but obviously back in the day he was well known. So that's why Charlie took that name as a fighting name and it's just stuck ever since. But on his return to prison in 1988, he again was testing the system, taking numerous hostages with confrontations with prison officers, and he even took a governor hostage as well. One of his more, I say recently, I think it was about over 20 years ago now, he took a hostage some Iraqi like plane jackers who were jacking a plane from Iraq to London, and that was in Belmarsh prison, which is a high security prison. He took these guys hostage, and in Charlie's own words, on an interview with Steve Wraith, who's a Geordie actor, he does publishing and things. He's done a lot of so-called interviews with Charles Bronson on YouTube, and in Charles' own words, the guy said, we hijacked a plane to get out of Iraq to escape Saddam Hussein's regime, and we met an even crazier person in prison, Charles Bronson. But yeah, so that's what he's known as. But eventually he was given a life sentence. He was given a life sentence in, I believe it was 1990, where he was in Hull prison, and he was on one of the special units where troubled prisoners like difficult ones who constantly fighting the system, will go into these special small units, like high security units, so they can be contained away from the general population. And he was on that unit with the likes of Paul Sykes, who's well known in Yorkshire. He was on that unit with Patrick Mackay, and I think Patrick Mackay's just been released. He was a serial killer from London. He's only just been released, so he was on that unit with a few faces. But anyways, he got a life sentence for taking one of the teaching staff hostage in the whole prison unit, and that's what he's been serving ever since. Well, minus the two armed robberies that he committed, obviously the two terrible offences, they both can carry life sentences on their own. But I mean, I've met many a armed robber who are out of prison after years they've been out, and Charles Bronson has essentially been kept in prison due to his behaviour in prison. That he's racked up a lot of GBH charges, a lot of kidnaps, hostages, threatening behaviour, other violent assaults, things like that. But it's all being done within the prison estate, which is why he has been deemed to be very violent. But his violence has only really stemmed from his time in prison. Bearing in mind, he has been in prison since 1974, and prisons today aren't like prison back then. And I know that from my father. When my father first came to the UK, he went to prison in 1987, I think it was, for a burglary or something. I mean, they didn't even have, my dad said they didn't even have toilets. My dad went to Durham prison in 1987, and when he visited me in 2017 in Durham prison, he was not sympathetic, because he was like, you have toilets, you have this, you have canteen, you wear your own clothes inside. It's like, back then you don't have nothing. We were shitting in buckets, 3 people to a cell, shitting in the same bucket. And so, but that's the tip of the iceberg, how prison was back then. It was, you were treated like animals. And Bronson was treated, even obviously because of his violent outburst, he was treated with a bit more sting, because he would be given what was called liquid cosh, which is where back then they could inject you with like a sedative to calm you down, and it would leave you like incapacitated for days afterwards. And they'd also put you in body belts. They can't do that now. It's basically, you're in handcuffs, but they're attached to a belt that goes around you, so you can't even lift your arms up. Your hands are basically chained to your waist, so you can't even scratch your ass. All that sort of stuff. And obviously screws back then would give you a good hiding. They still do that now and then in the prison estate today, but back then it was a bit more blatant. They would just kick the shit out of you, and they weren't even trying to hide that. That's what they'd do. So obviously Charles Bronson's outbursts back in the day were they were just reactions to how he was treated. And yes, he would kick off initially due to, that was his personality, but the prison service didn't really do a good enough job to calm him down. They basically just added fuel to the fire, and that's how he just continued fighting against the system, because a lot of people get into their heads, well, it's me against you and it's you against me, and it's hard to shake that off. And obviously Charles Bronson for many, many years was fighting the system, hence why he's been held in segregation down in the blocks, on 23-hour-a-day bang-up on his own, only allowed to go and exercise in cages, has to have his visits in cages. Still to this very day, that's how he has to have his visits, in very secure visiting rooms. And he's in his 70s. And he's not of much harm now, but he's still in a Category A prison estate due to his previous violent outbursts. But as of 2014, he changed his name to Charles Salvador, which was in a mark of respect to his favourite artist, which was Salvador Dali. And mentioning that, Bronson is known for his art, and he's obviously he's not allowed to make any money from his own artwork. He basically puts up his artwork for auction, and he set up his own charity auction site called the Charles Salvador Art Foundation, of which any work that he does, it gets sent there. He obviously sends some to his family and friends. It gets sent to the Charles Salvador Art Foundation, and that's where it gets auctioned off, and he raises money for charity. He's raised 5-figure sums for charity for his artwork, because he's a very, very talented artist. And that's how he likes to see himself, and that's how he's been behaving for about almost 15 years now. He's just been in his cell doing his art, going out doing a bit of exercise, and writing books and doing poetry, writing screenplays. And if you want to see what the sort of stuff Charles Bronson gets up to now, there's a lot of recent interviews between him, as I mentioned before, and Steve Wraith on YouTube. So if you want to type in Charles Bronson and Steve Wraith on YouTube, it's basically Steve Wraith. He's on phone calls with Charles Bronson, and they do fairly long interviews. So it is quite opening to see that these two guys just chatting like normal. And this is where I've got a lot of my information from, to be honest. As I've spent time in prison, I've obviously never spent time in prison with Charles Bronson, because he's in the high security estate. I was just in a Category B local prison. However, a lad 2 doors down from me on A-Wing in Durham, his brother was doing I think he still is doing it. He was doing life sentence for murder. And his brother was in Franklin prison, just up the road from Durham prison, which is a high security dispersal. And he was in there with Charles Bronson. His brother was in there with Charles Bronson. But Charles Bronson was obviously down the block. And his brother and Charles would make link now and then. And Charles would have these postcards that he'd send to his fans and stuff like that. And they'd have like a picture of the likes of the Cray twins, Frankie Fraser, what was he called? I can't remember now. He was known as the governor, big guy, Eddie something. Pictures of the old school faces from the criminal fraternity. That would be on the postcard, and he basically just write postcards to people. And this lad's brother got Charles to send the guy 2 doors down from me a postcard, because the lad 2 doors down from me was on remand for murder. He's obviously since been convicted. He got, I think, 23-year minimum. And Charles sent him a postcard basically saying, just keep your head down, don't fight the system, box clever with them, and make your time useful, get yourself into the gym, get yourself educated, and before you know it, your paroles will come up. Don't fight the system, don't get into drugs, and you'll be just fine. Basically giving him, a bit of a pep talk via the postcard. So that is the closest interaction, if you want to call it that I've had with Charles Bronson. But the purpose of this video is, should he be released? I know he had his parole a couple of years ago, a public parole hearing. I think it was the first ever public parole hearing down at the Old Bailey in London. And he got Charles Bronson got his parole knocked back because he hasn't worked his way through the system, and that's what it's called, working your way through the system when you're a long-term prisoner. So you start off in, your high security category A prisons, your dispersal prisons like your Franklins, Full Sutton, Wood Hill, Long Light, them sort of prisons. Gartree is another. And you work your way through, so you come down the category. So you come from your Cat A to Cat B, which is still like high security. And then once you've proved yourself up in the higher categories, you work your way through the system to category C, which is like a training prison, like a medium security. So the likes of, give you a few examples, like up here, HMP Home House, HMP Northumberland, Wymott. So you're training prisons basically. And once you've proved yourself there, you can then go for a parole hearing to see if you are eligible to be moved to open conditions, known as Category D, which is where you get home leaves, you're not banged up, you have free roam of the prison. So it's low security, just to prepare you for getting out, basically. And that was the parole board's concerns with Charlie Bronson, was he hasn't worked his way through the system. He's basically been in segregation for decades, and he's still held in, at the time he was held in Wood Hill, HMP Wood Hill, which is a category A dispersal. And he hasn't worked his way through the system, going down to your training prisons, your lower securities, and then your open conditions. He hasn't worked his way through the system. So that was their concern. So they basically returned him to prison and said, right, you need to try and get off segregation, get onto main location, see how you fare there, and then work your way through the system. But that will take years. That even takes good people years. There's people who will spend, a decade just in the high security estate. And I say good people, they're in prison for a reason, yes, but they're toeing the line, they're doing the courses they're meant to be doing, they're trying to keep their heads down to get out as early as they can. And if it takes them 10 years, someone like Charles Bronson, who's been fighting the system for decades, they're never going to let him progress, because progression through the system is not based on executive decision, it's not based on what the parole board say, it's inside decisions, such inside offender management unit. It's reports from your wing staff, it's reports from your custody managers. So it's all inside, and because he's been fighting the system for so long, do you think he's going to get this sort of support within the prison system? No. Which is why he's still being held in the conditions he has. He's a bloody old man. You should at least give him the chance now to progress through the system. But in my opinion, they're never going to let him. Personally, I think he should be released, but given the fact that he spent over 5 decades in prison, being released from being segregated for 23 hours a day, only getting an hour's exercise, and getting, going out to collect your meals and going back behind your door. Going from that to the outside world. Bear in mind, a lot has changed since he's been to prison. There's mobile phones. Obviously, mobile phones have progressed. It's going to look like something out of Star Trek to him. Cars have progressed. The way the world works has progressed. There's not a lot of it's paper-based now. A lot of it's digital-based. Something he won't be used to. Just the way society is now, how soft it is compared to how it was when he went in. That'll take some getting used to. It's going to be a big culture shock for him. A very big culture shock. I say culture shock. He's coming out to the same country he grew up in, but the world has changed whilst he's been inside. So I think that was another concern of the parole board as well. Should he be released after spending decades in segregation on the high security estate to straight out in the public? Personally, I can kind of understand that. It is a high risk situation. They hadn't even put a risk reducing program together for him, so it would just be taking the duck out of water, really. But on the moral side of it, I think he should be given a chance to either work towards release, or given a chance to work towards open conditions or a less stringent regime, just to give him the opportunity to see if he can integrate back into society. Because that's what he needs to do. He can't just be dumped straight back into society. There's no chance. Just no chance. Imagine you guys watching this video, you're living in a fairly, first world country. Imagine taking you out and putting you into the middle of the Ukraine somewhere, minus the war. The way the country's run is so different. It'll take a long time to get used to how things work over there. Same thing coming out of prison. I only done 6 months in prison. When I come out, it took me about 2 weeks to get my head back, to get used to cars going past me, and to get used to, having to think for myself. That pales in comparison to how it would be for him. But certainly he's being kept in because the prison service don't want to let him out. And people say, well, it's up to the parole board if they release him. Yes, indeed it is. That executive decision is the final decision, would they to let him out. However, what do the parole board look at? They look at his wing reports. They look at interviews with the offender management unit, i.e. inside probation. They look at all the security information about him. They look at his conduct from the first day he's come in. They look at everything. And if the prison service don't want good reports to go to the parole board, they ain't going to send good reports to the parole board. That's how it works. It is corrupt like that. The prison service want their pound of flesh off him, and they ain't got it yet. And they are never going to get it until the day that Charles Bronson passes away in prison. And that's how it's going to go. And that's what they want to do. On speaking with, connecting with people who have spent long time in prison, I speak to these kind of people online all the time. It's known, it's common knowledge within the system, within the prison system, that the prison service want Bronson as an example. This is what happens when you try and fuck about and try and, bug the system. This is what happens when you attack our staff. This is what happens when you take roofs off of buildings or in protest. This is what happens when you attack governors. This is what happens when you do not toe the line. You will never get out. And that's what they're using him for now, as a way of disciplining the rest of the prison estate. You fuck about, you turn on us, we'll fuck up your future release. That's how it goes. And that's what they're doing to him. But I think he does deserve a chance to be released. I reckon there needs to be some form of independent, not inquiry, but independent intervention to basically guide him through the system, to make it less based on what the prison service think and what, independent, open-minded people think. So, the prison estate has a board called the Independent Monitoring Board, which is basically like the Ofsted, but for prisons, really. And they're basically there to be impartial and ensure the prisoners have their rights met. And I reckon they need to be getting involved a bit to try and push his release along, or at least allow him the opportunity to go through the system at a good pace and get out. Because based on what the interviews I've listened to and the stuff I've read and the people I've spoke to, he's been ready to not ready for release because he's been inside for so long, but he's not been a violent man for many, many years. And that's enough. Let him progress through the system and give him the opportunity to get out. That's my view. But what's your view? Should Charles Bronson, basically used to be one of the most violent men in prison, should he be released? Or should he be kept inside for the rest of his life as a payback for decades of headache that he's caused? That's all I want to know from you guys. Should he be released or should he be kept in, and why? That's it. Let me know. Thank you very much. Peace and love.